Welcome to my lecture. My name is Angela Sung, and I'm really thankful that you guys purchased this demo. This is the image that we're going to be focusing on. It's a picture I took when I was in Cuba. The main thing that I usually focus on when I look at an image is how can I break down this image and boil it down to the most simple elements so that the viewer can understand. The one thing that I wanted to focus on is how there's all these cubes everywhere, and then there's like this element of like something cutting across it. So I really liked this about the photo, and I'm gonna push that idea as I take it to a finish. While these remain rectangular, I have like these rounded shapes in the back to contrast it, and then I have the rounded shapes on my building as accent shapes. So I always try to think about ways to add interest and how to like organize things so it's just easier to understand when you're looking at it. And this way, when you compare it to the final image, you can then see that like these little cracks are obviously really different than everything else. So you group them in that same manner as well. I also think about how to group the values. So right now you can see I have three value groups. I have the white here and here, and then I have the second darkest shapes, and then the darkest darks. When you look at my final image, it's basically kind of the same thing. I really try to focus on this area being the lightest. The blue is kind of a different value, and I did that so that these white areas can pop out more. And then I followed the same thing for these darkest darks to really push the idea of it like having an overhang. In the beginning, although I keep my space pretty clear, visually you can understand how stuff is receding in space, I don't try to sketch out every single little detail of my building. This is just thinking about the color relationships within the image rather than adding the shadows or adding the like molding around the windows. For me, it's really important to kind of see like, okay, is this blue for the sky working well with this yellow? Now you can see like, okay, so when I look at the sky, it may be a little bit too teal. Let's try to make it maybe a little bit more purple. And then as for this yellow, I know sunlight's kind of hitting it, so I'm gonna use a little bit of that sunlight logic to kind of be infused into my painting. So I'm gonna try to shift it over here, slowly try to change it a little bit. An easier way to do it is basically you hit colorize and then you can pick like the exact color within this spectrum. I think this feels a little bit better. The bottom part, which is warmer in comparison to the top or yellow, is feeling a little bit more muted. So I'm gonna pump a little bit more saturation in here to get it to work a little bit better. Trying to compare these specific color groups. Once you are a little bit more patient with it, then you're gonna be able to have an easier time, I would say, to pick out colors that represent that specific time of day that you're trying to convey. Once you remove the lines, you kind of have like this really solid color relationship. Then I go into another phase of adding the black and white version that we did in the first section. Take that design and see if it works with these colors. So that's what I'm gonna do right now. When you guys are painting an image, it's more about the big picture first and then the little details later. Get these big color relationships in first, then you can compare and contrast everything else. And it's really important to know that especially on a sunny day, the colors of the shadows are usually influenced by your whole environment. Right now, I don't necessarily think the shadow is like a blue-purple, but I'm just adding it in there because like I said, I'm trying to get that feeling of the light. And for this image, like I just love how the shadows were cutting into the building. Yeah, try to think about how like everything is being influenced not only by the sun, the bounce light of all the buildings around it, the cast shadows, the canopy, everything is influencing everything at this point because you have such a strong light source. So I think right now most of the relationships are feeling really good. It's kind of feeling like that time of day now. So I'm gonna go back in and start adding those little details like the cast shadows of the lip, I guess, of the building on the top of the main building. I'm sorry, I'm not too good with architectural terms. So right now what I'm doing is using the line tool to create the orange trims. And then I just wanted to let you guys know, if you hold down Control and you left click the layer that you just created, you could then go to the second layer on the top where I have my shadow, and then you could create a separate like color, kind of like this. I'm just gonna leave it for now. It's not necessarily the right color, but I'm just trying to show you guys how I usually try to accomplish it. So right now, what I'm trying to focus on is to create the darkest darks. If you look at the reference image, I'm comparing the darkest darks to several different areas. One of the areas that I'm looking at is kind of like these cast shadows that you see being casted into the windows, right? And then there's some on the bottom. Of course, the value here is going to be really different than the one here. The reason why is because you're surrounded by light in this area, so it's gonna appear darker than it actually is. So when you come here and choose the darkest dark, it's still gonna be darker than this one, but they have to kind of feel similar. And this is another really important thing about painting. It's basically about the contrast. So once I have this selected, I just wanted to get an idea and sense of how dark I can go in the lightest area. This is the brush I usually use to block stuff in. This is a pencil brush I made myself, so I'm going to be drawing something a little bit so you guys can see how it looks like. There's a little bit of like a toothy texture. Doing some color variations. It's really important for you guys to try to focus on the warm and cool differences of the colors. In each color there's going to be a cool and a warm, so I'll go to the side right now and then show you guys basically what I mean. Let me make this white really quick. So basically, when you're looking at a red, you have a warm red here. You can see that it's very hot. Then you have a cool one, which is a little bit more magenta. And this is where doing a lot of gouache will help. It teaches you how to mix colors. Same thing with blues, right? So you have a warm blue, which is slightly more ultramarine. Then you have something that's more cobalt. So it's like, this is more purple, this is more leaning towards the green side. So I'm just going to be talking about the primaries really quick. Then you have like a lemon yellow, and then you have a cat yellow. It's really important for you guys to think about stuff like warm versus cool. That's how you also get a lot of interest when you guys do a lot of paintings. It's really important for you guys to kind of pay attention to those little details, because I think that's where you get a lot of fun and colorful colors. It's not necessarily about like adding a crazy teal here or a crazy opera red in another area. It's just about how you control these temperatures. So if you guys are trying to get better at color, I really recommend not only doing some plein air painting, but just getting comfortable with mixing some color with gouache, acrylics, oils. They're all fine. Another really cool thing about painting is like, if you look at the reference image, there's like this cast shadow that's being casted onto this corner. The more you draw and paint, the more you can come up with these like really cool graphic shapes that represent something like receding into space. So for example, this one is like kind of like, if I'm looking at it in a 3D view, right, without the paint, you could see that there's like, it's slightly caving in a little bit, like it's being pushed in. So because of that, like I know that this is the reason why the cast shadow is being casted the way it is. So just being able to observe more will help you see these little details and make your paintings more believable. So right now, if you look at this area I just lassoed, it doesn't seem as dark as something like this. And this is kind of like what I was mentioning earlier. When you have darker surroundings, you kind of have to adjust your darkest darks. When you have a shadow being casted close to a ledge, usually the shadows are harder. So shadows are also extremely helpful at basically describing space and depth. So don't forget to use your edges to your advantage. So this one's slightly further away, so I'm gonna soften the edge. As you can see, as I'm working in the darker area, because this area is in shadow, it's not able to capture as much bounce light as, let's say, the area up top. So because of this, you're basically not going to have a lot of color reflections into this area. Usually in overcast areas or areas in shadow, it's more about the local colors and how subtle value and local color shifts. Also, I noticed that, like, if you look at this whole image, I added a little bit of color jitter everywhere. So if you think about building surfaces, they're not completely smooth, so they capture the light in a different way. And I'm trying to capture that idea with just like subtle textures. Please remember that when you're painting something in the shadow, it won't capture as much color. And I think this is kind of cool too, because then you can create this contrast of something that has less color down here in comparison to something with like a lot of color and interest. So this also creates a separate focal point. Okay, so right now I'm working on the top left of the shaded area, and I'm adding a little bit of blue right now because if you look at the reference image, that area there's like a little corridor-ish area, so there's a little bit of skylight coming through, and I wanted to indicate that. It's not going to be too powerful or overbearing, it's just going to be just a little tiny bit, just to indicate that there's like something like a hole where there could be like a skylight coming through. Let me just turn on my perspective grid so I can get the general area. I'm gonna guesstimate the sliver, so I'm just gonna delete this. I'm gonna repeat this color so it looks familiar. Don't forget these subtle little details because I think it can inform the audience a lot about what you're trying to convey. There we go. You could tell that there's an opening now, and that's why there's a little bit of blue coming through. So right now what I'm trying to do is paint the pillars. So this is kind of still in shadow, so I'm not going to try to add too much color in here. However, it's receiving a little bit more light than let's say the corridor area. So I'm going to be adding a little bit more color variation in terms of that. And I'm going to be focusing on the cool versus warm concept that I keep talking about. Also, when you guys are trying to do color, it's really important not to break the value groups that you've set up for yourself. So if I change this to black and white, when you squint your eyes, generally everything is still fitting pretty much into the breakdown that I had. I like to rotate my canvas horizontally to see how it's looking, because sometimes when you're looking at it for too long in one direction, it gets kind of, you don't see the mistakes as easily. As you can see, so when you compare something like over here to something like this, you can see that the colors are duller, but there's still some temperature shifts because it's receiving more light in this area. So I added a little bit more gray. So this is way cooler in comparison to this shape as it's turning, because it's a cylinder, right? So always do think about that. As you can see in the reference, there's not this little dot here. The reason why I like it is because I often like to use these opportunities to push the color sense more. Okay, so as I'm detailing this, another thing that I try to pay attention to, this is more about design. I kind of mentioned it in the black and white one, but generally speaking, when you look at my image, it's just boxes, repeated shapes all over, and then even these shapes are boxes. So when I try to detail it, I want to make those shapes different so they kind of stand out. So as you can see, these are more like organic, blobby, circular shapes. For me, it's really important to think about these stuff. So there's like a hierarchy in design. This looks more intentional, and these kind of become like the secondary accent shapes. This way the viewer might have an easier time understanding what they're looking at. So right now I'm picking the like the breaks within the building light side to add a little bit of that cool and warm relationship. So like when I turn it to black and white, you can't really tell that there's a color difference, but when I change it to color, that's what I do. This adds visual interest, and then also painting within the same value range is really a really helpful way to also introduce color into your image. So if you ever feel like something's boring, try to do that. It's kind of like the same idea as like these light spots here, and then the color jitter brush that I used on this orange area. So always introducing like subtle shifts in color and value are super important, and I think they elevate your color sense and also your image to like a whole new level. Right now I'm adding the detail for the lamppost, and I want you guys to pay attention to something. So usually when you have a color or a darker value, when it's against the sky, for example, it's going to be a different color than on the bottom. The reason for that is because colors, they react differently based off of the surrounding. So for example, if I come here and I do this blue box, and then I have an orange in the center. If you look at it, it looks really orange. What I like to think about is usually using complementary colors to bring out the true essence of a color you're trying to convey. But if I were to do an orange here, and let's just say I made it like a yellow or yellow-green. So these two colors immediately feel different, right? The vibrancy looks different, and this feels a lot more brown in comparison to this feeling more yellow and orange. So if I even like lowered the value, right, the colors would still feel really different. I feel this looks a little bit more pink now in comparison to that. So when you guys are choosing colors, be sure to have like an intention for each one. When you're able to control color like that, you can help it feel more natural. So this is what I'm trying to do here. I want to make this part feel warmer because it's against a blue, and I want this one to be slightly cooler because there's warm here, and then this can go back to warm because it's against the blue sky. And kind of like what I said earlier, when I was painting this area, the darks in this part will be a different value than this, but they still kind of have the same impact, right? They both still feel really dark. So everything is relative to one another, and when you're painting, whether it's colors or values, just be sure to pay attention to that. When I'm detailing the window, what I really want to watch out for are those like subtle shifts again. For like buildings that are a little bit older and kind of worn out, not everything is like perfectly flat, some are sticking out. So if you kind of think about it that way, you could just lasso certain areas. So like, for example, for this wooden piece, I could just say, okay, it's like sticking out a little bit more. It got weathered down, so I'm going to gray it. Then I'm going to lighten the color a little bit because it's catching more of the sunlight. I just keep doing like subtle shifts. I'm also going to add like the bottom lip of this orange trim. Don't forget that like how things are built into one another, it's really important to kind of think about it so you could figure out where and how to add cast shadows, areas where they're catching light. So I know a lot of people have difficulty painting cars sometimes. It is a pretty complex shape, but when you guys are painting cars, rather than think about like, oh, there's like a grill here, there's the headlights there, maybe try to simplify it and think about it in color blocks, kind of like what we were doing in the beginning of this demo, right? Like when we were blocking out everything for the color and setup. So I want you guys to kind of pay attention to that. Think about it as a surface change, but also think about it as a color change. What I keep trying to drill into your guys' head is that every surface, the way that it's colored is because of the way it's interacting with the environment. Yes, this is in the shadow, but the material is much more reflective than something like this. So the way that it captures the different colors of the surrounding is going to be different than a building. And that's another cool thing about cars. Since they're metallic, you could really easily indicate just like how metallic it is. So since the ground is a little bit more purple in my image, I'm just gonna make this side that's curving down to just like a slightly more purple-ish color. Right now, if you look at the reference photo for the background buildings, a really important thing to do is, or to think about, is basically when you're creating spaces like this, you want to imply depth, especially for environments. So they're kind of a similar color to like, I guess this foreground building here, right? If I drop this in, it kind of flattens the space a little bit. Since it's surrounded by cools, it's making this feel like particularly warm. So I'm going to try to change that. Remember, everything is relative to one another, so it might look great individually, but maybe in context of like a blue, it might feel a little bit warm. So just try to keep those things in mind and don't just view a color as a simple color. Think about it as like a whole and see how like the colors respond to one another. Don't forget, although this is in shadow, yes, it's more of the local color, but it's pointing like exactly, it's parallel to the sky right now, right? So I feel like it would reflect a little bit of the cool. Be sure to add in a little bit more cool in here. So you have those like nice contrasts of like cool and warm concrete. And even though I kind of erased all the lines there, I could lower the opacity and decide where to erase it later on. But I just want to, like I said, get that general color block and accurate color feel first. So one interesting thing that I've noticed for this reference photo is that there's several vanishing points. As you could see, when I started to first draw it, I used the ruler tool to kind of set up where I want my horizon line and my perspective points, my vanishing points to be. This is the one that's for like this house here. It's kind of interesting because I think when I imagine this shape from top-down view, this is the front of the building, and there's like a slight curve. Because I guess this is how that street looks like if I were to look at it from top view. There's like one vanishing point here, which is this one, and then there's one in the center, which kind of is in charge of like the little perspective lines here. And then this one here is going to be the one that enforces like the pedestrian lines, I guess. And then like all the other stuff that's kind of parallel to this plane. So just wanted to mention that. Sometimes you'll get images with very interesting perspective. So I think it's worthwhile to spend some time in the beginning to kind of break that down. I do a final adjustment pass, so I usually name it FX for effects. I usually do a color balance tool. I primarily did it in the shadow. So shadow side, I upped the blue a little bit to unify it, and then in the midtones I just did a little bit of red and a little bit of yellow, and then I added a curve layer to make it slightly, actually I like this contrast prior to my curve, so I'm just going to lower the opacity even more. Probably like 20% is good. I can then go add in a noise layer that I usually really love doing. So this is 225, so I'm going to make all of these 127. So when you do it to 127, basically what happens is you create a middle gray and you can overlay it so nothing really affects it. And then I go to filter, noise, add noise. This way it creates like this cool like grain effect. I think some movies do it. And then I usually lower it to like a 12% opacity. So it creates like this interesting noisy texture. I usually like having that there. Putting it in effects, shut it off so you could see the differences. Right now, what I'm doing is I just basically added in a person because I think this helps with the image to create not only scale but visual interest. When you're drawing something in like overcast or not in direct lighting, the shadows generally are very soft. because there's not like a direct source of light, right? So you need to be able to indicate that. So when you're drawing people here, it's very important to add the cast shadow. Yeah, I find that stuff to be very helpful in grounding the characters. So if you guys ever feel like something's floating, it might be because of that. Thank you for watching, and I hope you learned something. If you guys are ever interested, I also teach courses and I have gouache demos as well on my website. You can find all that information through my main website, angelasung.com, and it links you to my Podia where my classes and demos are. Yeah, hope you guys enjoy.